The white gunman has killed 10 people and wounded 3 others. 11 of the people who were shot were black. The gunman was an 18-year-old who wrote a white supremacist manifesto online. What can bring about hate in a white person so much to drive 200 miles to a black neighborhood and kill 10 people? In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at what police have described as a hate crime and why white-black tensions remain at a critically high level in the United States, including a review of other hate crimes that occur in that country. But first, let me introduce our guest for this edition of The Spotlight. Professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, Gerald Horne, joins us from Houston, Texas. Also joining us, editor of the Pan-African Newswire, Abayomi Azikiwe, who joins us from Detroit. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. So we're looking at an unprecedented incident that has taken place. It's really sad to see things like this happen time and again. Gerald Horne, let me first start with you. This has been categorized as a hate crime, and in my intro, I'm going to relay that question to you, of which, how much hate can a white person have for blacks, and in this case, to have so much hate to build up to commit such a horrific crime, driving 200 miles, and then kill 10 people as a result, and that could have been more.
We have a very seriously profound problem in the United States of America. And I think it's important for your audience to recognize that on the one hand, this is an elite phenomenon. That is to say, if you were able to tune into Fox News, one of the major cable networks in the United States today, which also has interests in Australia and in Britain, and in fact in India as well, you would hear the kind of rhetoric, the kind of language that helped to drive this sick, demented individual to slaughter all of these people in Buffalo. But at the same time, it's a mass phenomenon. In a few days, I'll have a book coming out on 19th century Texas, where I point out that if you look at the liquidation of what we call the Indian population, the indigenous population of North America, it not only came from mandates from the top, it came from actions by poor European settlers who wanted to seize the land of the Indians. And likewise, you have a number of white American working class and middle class people today who are rather easily manipulated by this point that supposedly the reason they're not doing very well in the economic marketplace is not because of the elites bringing down $14 million, $15 million salaries on an annual basis, but because of the fact that black people are stealing their jobs, that Mexican Americans are stealing their jobs, that immigrants are stealing their jobs. Because we have both an elite problem and a mass problem, it makes it even more difficult to solve.
Well, looking at what was described as one of the things that this white male had in terms of, or is in terms of his character makeup, Abayomi Azikiwe, is that he was called a white supremacist. So naturally, looking at the definition, which you can tell us what that is exactly. But then looking deeper into this, came across a terminology that it was called replacement theory from one outlet, and then it seems like the more prevalent term is called white genocide. I'd like for you to put that into context for us, the difference there, because white genocide, I think the white supremacist falls under that, if I'm correct to understand it. Perhaps you can tell us, Abayomi Azikiwe.
Well, thank you. The white supremacist ideology is deeply rooted in United States history, its institutions. This was founded as a white supremacist state going all the way back to the British colonies, the Dutch colonies in the Northeast. So this is nothing new. These mass executions, lynchings have been carried out from the period of enslavement all the way through the post-Reconstruction period, all the way into the 20th century. If we look just over the last several years, Dylann Roof walked into a historic African-American church in Charleston, South Carolina, and killed a number of black people based upon the same delusional racist ideological issues. So this is continuing inside the United States. Racist, what?
Okay, I'm going to get back to you, Abayomi. Let me get to Gerald Horne with this question about what is white supremacist and what is this white genocide, which is something that this particular person it was known to follow, which includes a whole variety of things, which basically is about how white replacement is being thrown about. It calls it many call it a conspiracy theory, but this particular person and many others like him believe in that. Can you please tell us what white genocide is?
Well, this fallacy of white genocide is the idea that there is some sort of plot to reduce or replace the population that is defined as white by Mexican immigrants, by Haitian immigrants, by African immigrants. The problem is that from the inception of this settler state and the settler colonies going back to the 1500s, about 500 years ago, this has been a territory that has been populated not only by people of European descent, but by people of non-European descent. The difference was that historically, the people of non-European descent were treated in a third class or fourth class manner. But the issue is that over the centuries, we've been able to organize, and now we are only treated in a second class manner. And many of those who are defined as white object to that. They think we should be treated in a fourth class manner. And that leads to this idea of white genocide, the fact that they're not able to treat us as if we were in apartheid South Africa in 1949. And likewise, this idea that they are not able to prevail. They're not able to necessarily get every job that they want in competition with Black people, for example. And of course, they consider the ultimate insult to be that Black men oftentimes date or even marry women that are defined as white. And that is the nub of the question.
Taking a look at the stats that are out there, it's alarming that you have hate crimes that have increased, and it's at a 10-year high. I looked at the stats from the year 2019 to 2021, Abayomi, and it states that there were roughly a little over 7,300 hate crimes, up from 7,100, and the highest number recorded since the year 2008. Now, when you talk about hate crime, obviously blacks are targeted. It's the highest category. So the first question is, why are blacks targeted? Which then brings about the question about hate crimes, not just involving African Americans, but then you go into Asians, for example. They have now turned up to be somewhat at the top. And then, of course, you have Latinos in there. And then we can go, of course, into categories like Muslims and Jews. So what's going on? First, why are blacks at the top of the list here?
Well, if you look at the history of the United States, the ruling class in this country was largely built as a result of the expropriation of African labor during enslavement. And even during the post-enslavement period, there's still the super exploitation of African labor. We also see it in those communities that are of Latin American descent, Asian American descent, and hate crimes are escalating against all people of color communities. In part, it has to do with, as well, the changing demographics of the United States, the fact that people of color communities are growing in regard to their proportion of the overall U.S. population. And many of these people tend to vote non-Republican, they tend to vote Democratic, but the Democratic Party does not have a program that can encompass their needs based upon their social status. So eventually, these people of color communities and other communities in the United States will break with the Democratic Party. And of course, when that happens, there is the propensity for even greater racial conflict in the United States. We saw in 2021 with the attempted right-wing coup at the aegis of former President Donald Trump. And there's a whole movement out there that is really an extension of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations that arose during the post-Civil War period. And these were rich, wealthy whites that formed the Ku Klux Klan. People like Nathan Bedford Forrest, who made a fortune as a slave trader, He was a general in the Confederate Army, and he was one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. So these policies come directly from the ruling elites here in the United States. So, and they're going to continue, and unfortunately, they're going to worsen in the years to come.
It's interesting, Gerald Horne, that our guest there says that, the fact that it's going to worsen, because I just talked about some demographics. So then what's left really are the whites, aside from the ones that I mentioned. But then even within the whites, there are frictions. For example, in Boston, if you go to the Harvard area, as opposed to the people who are over the river, there's clashes there in terms of just culture not mixing. And I'm talking whites within whites. So what's the big picture in the U.S.? I mean, multiculturalism obviously has failed, and yet it's gotten to a boiling point and crisis mode as we see incidents like this happen, where you have this white person come out and kill 10 African Americans.
Well, you have to realize that for decades now, the U.S. ruling elite has fought a very bitter struggle against the very idea of class solidarity. That is to say, working class people who are the majority and come from various ethnic and racial backgrounds, uniting in order to get higher wages and better working conditions. Because of this war against working class solidarity, you've had the proliferation, I'm afraid to say, particularly in the population that's defined as white, of a certain kind of racial and ethnic chauvinism. Indeed, it's not accidental, I'm afraid to say, that this massacre took place in Buffalo. Just a few months ago, you had a Democrat who also defined herself as a socialist, who was on the verge of being elected mayor of Buffalo, but the elites in the Democratic Party were afraid that her policies would lead to a redistribution of wealth from the top to the bottom, and they schemed to derail her candidacy and to make sure that she was. Likewise, if you look at the U.S. President, Joseph R. Biden, who about this racist massacre, recall that in the early 1970s, he got his start as a politician by campaigning and crusading against the very idea that there should be school desegregation by using buses. Supposedly he was against the bus, but as Reverend Jesse Jackson, a leader in this country, might have said at that time, he was actually against us. That is to say, he was whipping up hysteria amongst the so-called white majority in order to deflect attention away from the fact that those at the top of the socioeconomic pyramid, speaking of the 1% of the society, are making out like bandits at the expense of the white working class, and in fact, at the expense of the entire working class.
Sure. Well, it's very interesting how blacks are being targeted, or African Americans, I should say, Abiyomi Azikiwe, because the analysis drawn from that, from some, is the fact that the white, and I'm talking very generally, so pardon me for putting it this way, but I have a reason for that, because some are saying and deducting or analyzing, saying that, you know, the whites want to hold supremacy. I say that, and I want to put this next to this particular stat, which came out in the year 2019, that the cost of racism in the U.S. economy is costing the U.S. economy $16 trillion. 16. One figure from another source has put it at $50 trillion because of discrimination, and African Americans is part of that, including Latinos and people of color. If the U.S. government acknowledges this, which Biden did during his run as a president, when he was running for presidency, why isn't it doing anything about it? Why is it still continuing then, the issue of racism to the degree that it is, costing the government so much money?
Well, costing the government money is contingent upon what type of society we have in the United States. Racism, the super exploitation of labor of African people and other people of color communities is very profitable to the ruling interests in the United States. Disrupting that system would better the living conditions for the majority of people inside the United States. There's this divide, of course, between those who seek to bring about a broader democratic dispensation and those who want to narrow the dispensation to only include white males. And we see this in many different political debates taking place inside the United States. At this time, the U.S. is undergoing a very turbulent economic period with hyperinflation that we haven't seen in the last 40 years. And this is going to have a disproportionate impact on African Americans and people from the Latino community, as well as working class whites. So interjecting these hate messages in the white community to make it appear as if black people and brown people and indigenous people and Asian people, Muslims, women are taking away something that should be by right belonging to white men is a very dangerous ideology. And I don't think the growing people of color community inside the United States is going to tolerate this in the long term. African Americans have struck back against racist violence, and they will continue to do so. And it remains to be seen if these whites who are attempting to move the United States that far to the right will be successful. It's really open to question whether they will be or not, because in doing that, they're going to have to move against a great number of their own people.
Okay, so are we at that point, Gerald Horne, or have we passed it where we're going to see some kind of uprising? We see the protests happening when you have police brutality cases that involve, for example, a white police officer and how he has killed African American. We've seen that incident a number of times. But has it reached the crisis point where the uprising is going to be in large numbers and masses in the U.S.?
Well, that's one option. That is to say, a mass uprising that will beat back thoroughly and decisively the racists. Another option, I'm afraid to say, is the option of U.S. fascism. I would dare say that there are the seeds of fascism in the United States as we speak, based upon the point, as already has been mentioned, that the United States was built as a settler society involving liquidation of the Native Americans and expropriation of the labor of the Africans. However, I will also say that just as this racist terrorist in Buffalo received aid and comfort from abroad, the idea of replacement theory that he was spouting actually is an import from France that has been adapted in the United States. I think also that the fascists can be defeated, the terrorists can be defeated with international solidarity. Because keep in mind that if these fascists actually gain more power in the United States today than they wield at this particular moment, it will not only be people of color and black people in particular who are treated atrociously. This will inevitably be exported. That has been the lesson of U.S., the United States. That is to say, the problems in the United States do not necessarily stay inside of the United States. Inevitably, they're exported abroad, which is one of the reasons of why I would make an urgent and passionate call to our friends in Iran to rally to our defense, because this would not only be an act of charity on your part towards people struggling against dehumanization in the United States of America, it would be in your own self-interest as well.
Sure. It's interesting you use the terminology dehumanization, but what was also very interesting, which I think is going to be the last question here, Abayomi Azikiwe, is one of the things that this 18-year-old mentioned that he got his idea for doing and executing what he did was from the Brenton Harrison Tarrant case in Australia, in which you had him, doing that live streaming and killing 51 people. And of course, this was in a mosque and Muslims were targeted. I mentioned before that there are Jewish people that fall under this white supremacy, which some call conspiracy, of which they're saying that there's a plan that whites are being eliminated. Are there going to be? Is there a social crisis that the U.S. is engulfed in, where you have different demographics that may be, fighting each other? When you see cases like what we have witnessed with the killing of these 10 people, African Americans.
Most definitely. All you have to do is live in a U.S. city, whether it is a majority African American. I live in Detroit, or in other cities like New York City, Los Angeles, Seattle. And you can see the growing class divisions. You can see the racial polarization that is taking place. And unfortunately, neither of the two dominant political parties inside the United States has any program to address these issues. They are being
They do or
allowed
they don't?
to fester. Yeah, they're allowing these problems to continue to escalate. And as long as they escalate, it's going to worsen the capacity of the United States to act in any type of unified fashion. And it's just going to worsen the overall social conditions inside the United States.
Okay.
And
I can give Gerald Horne. I can give Gerald Horne
War.
30 seconds there. Gerald Horne. So, you said that Iran could help, but let's put the context domestically. In your capacity, what can you do, and what would you advise others in order to stop this crisis that the U.S. is experiencing between different classes?
Well, the elephant in the room is the proliferation of weapons. It was quite simple and easy for this terrorist to buy a weapon, even though he explicitly said that it could be used to kill human beings. Unfortunately, there is a logjam in Congress with regard to circumscribing the sale of weapons. If you don't want to circumscribe the sale of weapons, of course, you could circumscribe the sale of bullets. But unfortunately, there's no political will for either.
Thank you very much for that, Gerald Horne there, Professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston. Thank you for your thoughts. And editor of the Pan-African Newswire, Abayomi Azikiwe from Detroit. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight from Ikabe Tahwe and the team. It's goodbye until next time.